Breaking news. The world wakes up to a silence that doesn't feel real. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, the stubborn heartbeat of heavy metal, the man who somehow outlived every headline that predicted he wouldn't, has died at 76. July 22, 2025. After years of health battles that he fought like only Ozzy could, the last note finally fades. If this man's voice ever got you through a night you didn't think you'd survive, if one riff made you feel less alone, tap the like button as a small gesture of respect. Because this isn't just the end of a career. It's the end of a defiant kind of noise. He was born John Michael Osbourne in Aston, Birmingham, smoke in the air, coins counted on the kitchen table, a mother who could stretch a pound and a father who brought home metal dust from the factory on his boots. Dyslexia made school feel like a wall he couldn't climb. The world called him slow, then crueler names, and he wore those labels like weights tied to his ankles. He shoplifted, he stumbled, he learned the sterile geometry of a cell at Winson Green Prison and felt time slow to a crawl. He would later say the Beatles cracked his skull open and poured light in. One needle drop, one harmony that sounded like a door unlocking, and he decided the noise in his head could be something else, shaped, sharpened, shared. Music wasn't a hobby. It was escape. It was oxygen. They called the band Earth at first. It didn't fit. The sound they were making was something heavier, something church bell dark with a storm rolling behind it. Black Sabbath came like a dare. The tritone, the church mothers clutching pearls, the Friday the 13th mythology wrapped around their first album in 1970. Birmingham boys with factory lungs building a cathedral out of distortion. Paranoid raced up the charts like a siren, but beneath the speed there was ache, poverty that clung, anxiety that chewed, a singer who couldn't quite outrun the fog in his chest. The stage cured him at night and abandoned him by morning. The scream was the cure. The silence was the sickness. With success came the slow unraveling. Hotels that looked the same. Mornings that never arrived because night never ended. Addiction is a thief that lives in your mirror. Ozzy watched it pocket his discipline, his memory, his patience. In 1979, the band that had transformed him cut him loose, and the world said the inevitable had finally happened. This is where a life usually collapses, when the freefall becomes a crater. Instead, a woman looked at the ruin and saw a stage being built. Sharon, manager, compass, adversary when she needed to be. She found musicians who were not just skilled, but alchemists. Randy Rhoads was a phenomenon, a guitarist who could make a solo climb like a prayer and dive like a hawk. They made Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman and proved that you can be exiled from your origin and still find your purpose. Reinvention isn't a costume. It's scar tissue that learned how to sing, then the sky broke. A small plane. A moment you can't rewrite. 1982 took Randy and left a hole that no song could fill. Grief is not dramatic in the way movies promise you. It's repetitive. It's waking up every day in a world that keeps not containing the person you need. Ozzy did what he always did. He tried to drown it, then to document it, then to outlast it. The late 80s found him oscillating between the edge and the studio, circling the drain and then punching out of it with songs that sounded like letters you sent to yourself from the future. No more tears. The ache clotted into melody. The promise that he wasn't done. Survival wasn't a triumph. It was stubbornness. He was very, very good at stubbornness. The body keeps score. 2003, a quad bike, and a nightmare headline that almost came true. Broken bones, a coma, a family holding its breath for days that felt like winters. He climbed out of it like he had climbed out of everything else, unsteadily, then with jokes to make other people comfortable. Years later, in 2019, one bad fall and a chain reaction reminded him that gravity never negotiates. Parkinson's came with a name and a prognosis, but names aren't everything. "I'm wobbling," he admitted once, with that gallows warmth that made millions feel like they knew him, but "I'm not ready to hang up the mic." The condition tried to make him small. He refused. He kept practicing the only ritual he believed in. Make a sound louder than your fear. He lived in public more than most of his generation. The soft chaos of a family turned into television. the brittleness, and the love edited into 22 minutes. People who grew up on his records met the father, the husband, the man who misplaces his glasses and says the wrong word and loves fiercely. It's easy to worship statues. It's harder and more honest to love a person. When he faltered, we watched. When he got back up, we cheered. Not because he was perfect, but because he didn't pretend to be. He made the struggle visible, and in making it visible, he made it survivable for others. The final years were a negotiation with time. Home modifications. Doctors who spoke in probabilities. Fans who spoke in thank yous. He tried shows and had to cancel some. He promised appearances and had to pull back. Each announcement felt like a bruise on hope, and still hope returned, because that's what he had trained it to do. Then Birmingham called, the city that built him and hurt him and handed him an accent you could spot through walls. July 5th, 2025, one more night. One more hymn to the machine that made him. He didn't just sing, he blessed. He thanked. He reminded everyone that the origin of heavy metal wasn't rage, it was resilience. There were donation buckets at the exits for the hospital wing that had walked him back to himself, for the animal shelters he loved, for the music program that put instruments in the hands of kids who felt like he once did, boxed in, mislabeled, waiting for a chord to carry them out. There is a line he used to say, half joke, half gospel. It's just the next tour, without the sound check. Acceptance that didn't sound like surrender. A promise to keep moving, even if the movement is smaller, slower, gentler. When the news finally came, July 22nd, 2025, it didn't compute at first. How do you process the quieting of a voice that turned quiet into an enemy? The official statements were respectful. The fan posts were messy, human, full of blurry photos and captions like, "Thank you for getting me through sophomore year," or, "You were my dad's favorite, now you're mine." Legacy isn't a statue. It's a chain letter through time, signatures layered until the ink looks like a choir. He leaves behind numbers that make accountants nod, royalties that will keep humming for decades, trusts for family, funds earmarked for causes that mattered when the stage lights dimmed. But the number that matters most is simpler. How many people felt braver because he yelled first? You can count record sales. You can't count that. You feel it. In the gym at 2 a.m. In the car on the drive back from a hospital you weren't ready to leave. In the basement where the amp hums and you're sure no one will ever hear what you're making, and you play anyway because someone taught you to be loud about what hurts. You'd think this is the part where we wrap him in legend and file him next to other icons, polished, untouchable. But Ozzy's gift was that he never asked to be polished. He asked to be true. He was a mess who loved, a survivor who admitted fear, a clown who understood darkness better than most poets. He screamed so the rest of us could whisper, then speak, then sing. The world is quieter today, but it's not empty. There are echoes everywhere. If these words stirred something in you, if a Sabbath riff raised the hair on your arms, if "Mama, I'm coming home" ever felt like a phone call you needed but didn't get, share a memory in the comments. Tell the story of the first time the needle dropped and your life tilted. Somewhere a kid in Aston is going to read it and realize that noise can be a lifeline. Tap like as a sign of respect, and subscribe if you want us to keep preserving the histories that matter, the ones written in sweat and volume and second chances. Rest now, Ozzy. No more pain. No more hospitals. No more fights with gravity. Just light and the kind of silence you earned. The rest of us will handle the noise from here. Grief always edits the story to its sharpest points, but the long version matters. Because the long version is where the miracles hide. In Aston, the noise that made neighbors complain became a compass. A teenager with secondhand shoes and a head full of static met 3 lads who spoke distortion as a first language. Tony with hands that could carve riffs into monuments, Geezer turning bass into weather, Bill playing drums like a storm crawling over slate rooftops. They didn't dress it up. They didn't ask permission. The name change to Black Sabbath wasn't just branding. It was omen, permission to channel dread into ceremony. What the critics called evil was, for the working-class kids pressed against stage barriers, a translation of their own lives, factory sirens disguised as guitar feedback, layoffs disguised as minor key hymns, the future pronounced without vowels. War Pigs, Iron Man, Paranoid, you can map entire neighborhoods by the way those songs sit in people's bones. Fame makes the room bigger and the clocks faster. It also magnifies the cracks. The touring loops blurred cities into lobby carpets and room service menus, the hours between sound check and the last encore becoming dangerous. A man who'd been told he was broken found an easy way to break himself on purpose. At first, it anesthetized the panic. Then it anesthetized everything. There's a photograph from those years, eyes glassy, smile tilted, the posture of someone who is present the way a shadow is present. You love that man because he's Ozzy, but you worry for John Michael, the kid from Aston who needed someone to change the subject. Bands are families until they aren't. In 1979, the conversation ended. Fired. The headline bit. The public nodded like they'd predicted it. He went to a hotel room and waited to become a cautionary tale. Sharon didn't wait. She didn't believe in cautionary tales. She believed in work. She believed in gathering the right people and insisting on order where chaos had become the new god. She walked into the room and saw not the wreckage, but the blueprint underneath. Decision by decision, she reassembled a life. Sober hours, studio time, musicians who were hungry enough to chase brilliance without stepping on each other's throats. Randy Rhoads arrived like lightning, deciding to commute through a human being. He was young but not naive, scholarly but not stiff, precise without becoming cold. What he and Ozzy built on Blizzard of Oz wasn't a comeback. It was a statement that you can be exiled from your origin and still invent a new country where you belong. Crazy Train is the proof, joy and panic braided into a melody that refuses to stop at red lights. Mr. Crowley drips candle wax and cathedral echo, but the real seance is courage. The voice that had always been part howl, part prayer found exactly the right door to knock on. The problem with miracles is that they don't make the world less fragile. They only make it more visible. The day we lost Randy, time didn't behave. A fence, a plane, a mistake that should have been impossible, and suddenly you are standing in a parking lot under a sky that won't answer questions. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was a future. Ozzy folded in on himself and did the thing grief demands. He tried to disappear into the liquids that promised an off switch. But Sharon, again, refused to let silence win. She pulled him toward stages, toward studios, toward the kind of exhaustion that survives the night. Jakey, Lee took the guitar slot. Zakk Wylde would arrive later like a younger brother with hands made of oak and thunder. The alchemy changed, as alchemy must, but the premise stayed the same. Build cathedrals out of noise sturdy enough to shelter the lost. When the 90s arrived, Ozzy had something else, time-logged. He had rehearsed Survival so many times it began to look like routine. No More Tears isn't just a title, it's a dare. The verses move like someone walking deliberately past open doors, refusing invitations to old habits. Mama, I'm Coming Home turned stadiums into living rooms and taught men who struggle with the word sorry to sing it instead. And then came the piece no one predicted would fit, but somehow did. Family, unvarnished, on television. The Osbournes took the myth of the bat-biting rocker and introduced it to the mundane hilarity of misplacing remote controls. People laughed, yes, but they also saw tenderness sneak past the punchlines. Sharon's steel and silk management of a house that doubled as a circus, kids learning to be kids on a set where the fourth wall had taken a vacation, a husband with a body that sometimes refused orders and a heart that rarely did, and still the body kept records like an unforgiving archivist. The 2003 accident on his Buckinghamshire property felt like fate sneaking out from the curtains again, a metal animal arguing with a human body and nearly winning. There were hours no one wants to remember, and then there were days he doesn't remember, but the people who love him will never forget. He came back the way he always had, slowly at first, with the off-balance gait of a man trying to locate the edges of himself, then with jokes that made the room exhale, then with a microphone, daring the air to disagree. In 2018, No More Tours 2 arrived like a wink at mortality. Titles are sometimes talismans. Sometimes they are warnings. The 2019 fall, the cancelled shows, the announcement that the tremor had a clinical name, Parkinson's, turned every plan into a pencil sketch. He spoke about it plainly. "I'm wobbling," he said, in a sentence so much braver than the bravado other men paint themselves with. The wobble wasn't a prologue to quitting. It was a variable to be managed, a drumbeat to learn to walk with. What makes all of this more than a rock biography is the way love refuses to be ornamental. Sharon's love was operational, messy, unsentimental, fierce. It included ultimatums when the story demanded them and bandages when the blood insisted. It included sitting in green rooms with spreadsheets and in hospital rooms with patients. It included honesty that didn't pause for camera angles. Love isn't romantic in the soft focus sense when it has to share a house with fear. It's romantic in the sense that it chooses, again and again, the same person standing under a different storm. Their fights were famous. So were the reconciliations. So was the decision revisited, recalibrated, to keep going. There's a photograph from the July 5th, 2025 night in Birmingham that belongs in a museum. The crowd is a horizon, thousands of hands forming constellations. The lighting is cathedral gold. He's at the mic with that tilt that says, "I'm listening to you too." The original Sabbath faces appear like a family photo where certain ghosts have been temporarily excused from duty. What the camera can't capture is the way the room forgave itself. In the audience were 40-year stories, fathers who took their daughters to the show to repay a debt to the past, sons who brought their mothers and watched them cry during the opening notes, because sometimes the body recognizes a song before the brain catalogs it. The set list wasn't just hits, it was history writ loud enough to shake dust from the rafters. When the house lights lifted, people didn't rush the exits. They lingered. They put money in charity buckets and wiped their faces and hugged strangers like cousins. That's what a legacy is when it's honest. It turns strangers into something else for a few minutes and sends them home better. The days after were the soft focus montage life does not actually provide. Doctor's appointments. Good mornings that arrive later than intended. Grandchildren who treat fame as furniture and ask for biscuits. Podcasts where he laughed loudly and then paused in the way that made interviewers lean forward. DMs he would never see from people who finally had words for their gratitude. Quiet. More quiet than he liked sometimes. He made new rituals out of it. Coffee in a favorite mug. Walks that required patience. The occasional studio visit to breathe in that old machine smell, to close his eyes and remember how a room feels when a riff finds its final shape. It's just the next tour. Without the sound check, he'd say, and even when the joke hurt, it helped. News like July 22nd arrives like weather, first as rumor, then as a pressure change, then as rain. The first posts were careful. The second wave was chaotic. Some outlets rushed. Others waited. The family spoke with the right combination of specificity and guardrails, telling the truth without letting strangers camp in the living room. The phrase, "after years of health challenges," appeared, a respectful umbrella that didn't dare pretend the details belonged to anyone else. Musicians he'd mentored called him a North Star. Musicians he'd never met called him the reason they survived high school. You would think the loudest tributes would come from arenas. Some did. But many arrived from small rooms where small speakers work too hard, from bedrooms where teenagers do what they've always done, close the door, press play, make sense of the day. Funerals are for the living, and so is legacy. You can bullet the career, and you should, but the math is incomplete without counting the rooms he made safer. How many people chose not to do violence to themselves because a song gave them a pause they needed? How many kids found out their brains weren't wrong? They were just tuned to a frequency that required a different dial. How many fathers learned to apologize because singing it was easier than saying it, and then suddenly, miracle, saying it became possible? The numbers are unknowable. The consequences are not. The night after the announcement, record stores hung black ribbons in their windows. Venues dimmed their marquees. Pet shelters posted photos and notes about a donor who never needed credit but never missed a chance to help. Hospitals acknowledged a fund that bought machines that hung quietly under fluorescent light while families count breaths. It would be clean to say the scream defeated the silence. But that's not what happened. They learned to live together. Ozzy taught us that. He screamed for us when we were too small to do it ourselves. Then he learned to be quiet in public without pretending he liked it. He accepted help without collapsing into self-hatred. He let his body be weak without deciding his soul had to be too. He learned to wobble and keep walking. He turned survival into choreography. That is not glamorous. It is holy. You can visit the music like a grave, but the metaphor is wrong. Graves are for endings. Songs are rooms you can re-enter. When the first notes of No More Tears arrive, you are permitted to be the age you were when it saved you. When Paranoid hits, you can be ridiculous, 19, invincible, and ruined at once. When Mama, I'm Coming Home opens its palm, you're allowed to forgive yourself for the decade you tried to outrun. That is what he gave us. Not just volume, but permission. If you're watching this with tears in your throat and a smile you can't quite iron flat, you're doing it right. Grief is a braid. We carry him forward the way we carry every loud, flawed, luminous human who turned their pain into architecture. Tell your story below. The first record you bought with your own money, the bootleg you wore thin, the moment a lyric felt like a hand on your shoulder in the worst room of your life. Someone will read it and find their way back to themselves. And if you've still got an instrument leaning against a wall, pick it up. Tune badly. Play anyway. Scare the quiet out of your apartment for 3 minutes and call it a ritual. He would have liked that. He would have laughed that laugh, the one that arrives like a door being kicked open and told you to keep going. Because that's the last, best lesson. Survive long enough to become tender. Scream long enough to hear the echo sound like love. Rest easy, John Michael Osbourne. The factories are quiet. The stagehands have gone home. Somewhere a kid lowers a needle and a universe begins. There's a certain way grief moves through a city. It starts in private phones lighting up, texts that say, "Are you seeing this?" And then it leaks into public ritual. The day after the announcement, Birmingham looked different. Shop windows that normally held guitars and motorbike jackets suddenly held candles. In Aston, where the streets still remember the boy who couldn't sit still in class, kids wore makeshift shirts with stenciled bats not because they believed in spectacle, but because they understood symbols are shortcuts to belonging. Outside a record store, an older man placed a battered Paranoid LP in the window and taped a note to the sleeve. From one factory kid to another, thank you for the map. You can judge a legacy by the way it organizes strangers. Ozzy's legacy turned sidewalks into pews. In Los Angeles, the machinery of television and memory spun up. Producers wanted timelines, fans wanted stories. The best tributes refused the tidy arc and chose the complicated one: addiction and apology, relapse and return. The absolute miracle of a marriage that survived what most marriages cannot. Colleagues spoke from green rooms that smelled like old coffee and bad decisions, telling the kinds of half-funny, half-sacred stories fans keep for hotel bars. A guitarist remembered watching Ozzy step onto a stage he had no business stepping onto, ravaged by travel and tremor, and then watching the tremor stand down because the body recognized home. A drum tech remembered a quiet 5 minutes before a gig where Ozzy asked the simplest question in the world, "You doing all right, mate?" and then waited for the answer. Fame bends time, but kindness arrests it. People remember who waited for their answer. The academies and halls drafted their statements. Words like indelible, pioneer, iconic. All true. All insufficient. What these institutions can inscribe onto plaques is the physics he rewrote on stage. He made heaviness move. He took riffs that should have pinned you to a wall and taught them choreography. The voice, higher than his speaking register, nasal in a way that critics mocked until they realized the frequency cut through any mix on Earth, rode over the storm, and turned it into a navigation system. It's easy to imitate volume. It's hard to imitate intent. Listen again, and you'll hear that the howl always contained a plea. Not for forgiveness. He rarely asked that on mic. For witness. For proof that someone out there could hear the electric hurricane and translate it back into human. People will, inevitably, argue about the infamous stories, the bat, the dove. The acts of rebellion that became gross-out parables for people who prefer spectacle to context. Here is the context. A working-class kid taught the world that transgression can be theater, that horror can be harnessed, that fear can be funny when you point it at the right target. Was he reckless? Absolutely. Did he learn to apologize? Eventually, and loudly, and in public. The point isn't that he never crossed lines. The point is that he spent his later years drawing better maps for the next generation, showing them where not to step, how to step back, how to keep the art loud and the harm minimal. He learned stewardship without neutering the danger that makes good art wake people up. At home, the rituals turned specific. Sharon spoke less to cameras and more to closets. What do you keep? What do you give? Which jacket carries a story you're not ready to fold? Which award goes to the foundation auction and which returns to the shelf because your granddaughter points at it and says, that one. Grief is paperwork, too. Signatures in offices that smell like lemon cleaner, conference calls where you mute yourself to cry. Through it, the family protected a single sentence. We will honor the person, not the persona. That means telling the truth about the dark years without letting them eclipse the rest. It means refusing to let strangers litigate private tenderness. It means answering the mail from a teenager in Ohio who says your husband's music interrupted suicide and making sure there's a reply that says, so did he, many times. You're in good, stubborn company. Keep going. There was a memorial in Birmingham that didn't bother with velvet ropes. People brought objects like offerings to a myth and then laughed because the myth would have rolled his eyes. A construction worker in Dayglow orange set his hard hat on the curb, scrawled with lyrics in black marker. A woman in a hospital volunteer vest laid down a photocopy of a donation check with the numbers blacked out and the memo line visible, because of Ozzy. An old teacher, shoulders straight as if his spine still answered to school bells, tucked a note into the flowers. I was wrong about you. You were never slow. You were a comet. In the middle of the crowd, two teenage boys argued about whether Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or Master of Reality was the hill to die on, and their debate made onlookers grin because continuity is the only immortality that isn't a metaphor. The industry will count streams and sales spikes, and those numbers will be staggering. But a quieter metric tells the truth more honestly. Guitar shops reported a run on cheap practice amps and the kind of SG knockoffs kids can afford with weekend money. In bedrooms across postcodes and zip codes, fingers bled and tendons protested, and wrists learned angles that feel impossible until they don't. Whole subgenres flickered to attention like constellations finding their shape again. Doom kids, stoner metal devotees, the prog curious who love a riff that takes the scenic route. Everywhere, bands that had been flirting with mediocrity decided to risk embarrassment instead, to write something too big for their rooms on purpose. That's the only metric that matters. Complication begetting courage. It's easy, in the glow of eulogy, to smooth out the contradictions. Don't hold them up to the light. He was loud and gentle, disciplined and chaotic, reckless and responsible in rounds that would make a therapist sigh and then smile. He loved animals because they did not bargain, because they told the truth with their eyes. He loved his fans because they obliged him to do the one impossible thing, become better in public. He disappointed people he loved, and he apologized to people he had scared. He fell down, and he learned tricks to stand even when the floor pitched. He spent years learning the difference between performance and persona, then spent more years teaching it to kids who mistook being outrageous for being brave. Bravery, he discovered, is often quieter than a headline. It looks like going home. It looks like showing up. You might be watching this with your parent, the one who wore a denim jacket covered in patches, and now keeps their keys on a lanyard for convenience. You might be across a continent from the person who first sent you Crazy Train as a dare, and the two of you are texting in the kind of shorthand that contains whole summers. You might be alone, letting the speakers do the work, letting the bass turn your ribs into an instrument. Wherever you are, do this. Picture the kid in Aston who thought he would spend his life working with metal, because that's what men did in his neighborhood. Now picture him discovering a different kind of metal, a molten, shapeless thing that took discipline to hold. Picture him learning to pour it into forms. Picture him spilling a lot of it along the way. He didn't waste the spills. He turned them into warnings with jokes stapled to the end. He turned them into songs. There will be posthumous releases. There always are. Alternate takes, live boards, demos with a cough left in, and a mistake that reveals the muscle memory under the magic. Approach them the way you approach a box of old photographs. Don't hunt for perfection. Look for the way the room feels. Listen for the between moments, the count-in, the laugh after the flub, the breath before the leap. That's the part you can carry forward into your own life. Excellence isn't an aura. It's a habit. It's 1,000 tiny tries. It's 1,000 little humiliations you outlive, because the thing you're building is worth the cost. In the weeks that follow, the noise will dim. That's healthy. You cannot mourn at maximum volume forever. Grief becomes a roommate rather than an intruder. It does the dishes sometimes. It hogs the remote. You forgive it. You will go back to your shifts, your kids' homework, the text threads that keep joy from bleeding out of the day. And then, when you least expect it, a grocery store will play a song it has no right to play through ceiling speakers, and you'll stop between the cereal and the tins and smile like a thief who just spotted a friend in the crowd. That's how you'll know the loss has settled into something gentler. Not absence. Presence with the sharp edges sanded down. If you've made it this far, you are part of the work now. Leave a memory below, first concerts, last goodbyes, the lyric that made you choose differently on a night you were sure the dark had the final vote. Share a photograph with bad lighting and worse hair. Write to the kid who hasn't found their band yet and tell them how to start. If you can, give to the causes that kept him stitched together when the seams wanted to split. Parkinson's research, animal rescues, music programs where a teacher might hand a trembling kid a secondhand guitar and say, try. Tap like as your candle. Subscribe if you want more history told with the reverence and noise it deserves. And then, this matters, be kind to the people in your orbit who are wobbling. Help them keep walking. That's the truest tribute. Some farewells are doors slamming. Some are windows opening to a draft that smells like rain. This one is both. The slam tells us a chapter ended. The draft tells us the book keeps breathing. We will miss the laugh that sounded like trouble. We will miss the stubbornness that made doctors sigh. We will miss the way a chorus could turn a crowd into a single organism, each throat borrowing strength from the one next to it. But we will not be quiet. Not now. Not after everything he taught us about turning fear into sound. Rest, Ozzy. Rest, John. Rest, Dad, Granddad, husband, friend. Rest, architect of the loudest cathedrals we've ever prayed in. When the lights go down tonight, somewhere a teenager will press record on a phone balanced on a shoebox and make their first terrible, wonderful song. And somewhere, in the thick of the city that made you, a factory will finish its shift and a worker will step into air that feels a little bigger than it did yesterday. That's your work, still working. That's the echo you earned. Months pass and the headlines fold themselves into the back of the paper where anniversaries and weather live, but the living keep finding new ways to say his name. In classrooms with posters curling at the corners, music teachers cue up the same old riffs and watch as a new set of teenagers performs the miracle of recognition, eyes widening at a chord change that predates them by half a century, feet tapping in rhythms learned from older siblings and parking lot speakers. You can tell when a song has become infrastructure. It stops needing an introduction. It simply turns on the lights and people know where to stand. Craft is a quieter thread in his legend, and it deserves its own frame. People remember the howl, but the craft inside the howl is what made it carry. The trick wasn't volume, it was clarity under pressure. He sat on the pitch like a tightrope walker with a grin he hadn't earned yet, the notes narrow enough that a lesser singer would wobble into chaos. Double tracking turned one voice into a chorus of shadows, tiny imperfections becoming fingerprints rather than flaws. Producers favored a sheen that could survive the journey from cheap car stereos to arena arrays, the consonants sharpened just enough to cut through a forest of guitars. The choruses weren't accidents, they were engineered lifelines. The verses didn't meander, they coiled, patient, like springs. Even the ad-libs, those ragged "all right s" and "come on s", were seatbelts, reminders that a human being was driving the storm. Somewhere a journalist tries to map influence and fails because the routes are too many. The obvious line runs through heavy music in all its dialects, Doom's cathedral trudge, Stoner's resin-thick reveries, Thrash's asphalt sprint, the prog kids who insisted that a riff could be a labyrinth if you fed it right. But there are stranger tributaries. A bedroom pop artist loops a phrase until it stops behaving and learns that repetition is a kind of exorcism. A hip-hop producer samples a snare that sounds like a door slammed by a polite ghost and discovers the gleam in grime. A film composer steals the menace without the volume and scores a subway scene that makes commuters check their reflections in the dark window glass. He taught people how to be heavy without being clumsy, how to be theatrical without lying, how to turn fear into architecture you could dance under. The tributes settled into cycles. Glossy shows where legends dress like civilians and civilians dress like legends. Small room wake-like gigs where everything went wrong in the way that makes a night unforgettable. You don't measure a tribute by perfection. You measure it by the number of times strangers forget themselves. In New York, a choir took no more tears and bled the consonants until the vowels floated like lanterns. In Sao Paulo, the pit for Paranoid turned into an act of collective CPR, bodies catching and releasing in a rhythm older than language. In Osaka, a trio of teenagers dragged their amps into a park and let the feedback stitch together people who hadn't planned to be a crowd. In Douala, a father and daughter argued joyfully about tempo and then nailed it, the girl's grin visible a block away. In Lagos, a rooftop band rehearsed until neighbors started texting requests like love notes. The world was smaller for a while. Or maybe it was just closer. Families mourn in specifics that never make the news. A wristwatch wound and then placed back in a drawer. A mug with a chip that you keep reaching for because the hand knows what it wants. Dogs who pause at doors that will not open and then, slowly, learn new routes. Sharon reread the practical lists she'd written in years when lists were the only way to move through a day: meds, calls, meals, rest, and discovered they had become a record of love disguised as logistics. She decided which jackets needed to be worn by grandchildren playing dress-up and which needed the stillness of a glass case. She made space for quiet and then filled some of it with noise on purpose, dialing friends who knew the difference between condolence and conversation. Grief doesn't want expertise, it wants company. The house learned a new heartbeat, not better, not worse, just honest. People sent letters because the internet, miraculous as it is, sometimes fails to hold weight. One arrived from a paramedic who used to blast Sabbath in the ambulance between calls and learned to breathe to a tempo that was, in its own way, life-saving. Another from a teacher in rural Nebraska who smuggled riffs into the curriculum under the pretense of poetry and watched a population of checked-out kids sit up. Another from a woman in her 60s who wrote in round, careful script about a hospital room in 1991 where "Mama, I'm coming home" kept a vigil that words could not. These are not fan notes. They are affidavits. They testify that art can be evidence. There's a temptation to fossilize the past, to pick a golden year and pretend everything after it was epilogue, but he refused that even while alive. The late records, the experiments, the collaborations that raised eyebrows, this was a man still curious enough to risk embarrassment. Curiosity is braver than cool. It means you will sometimes reach beyond your grip in public. It means you will sometimes discover, in front of the whole room, that the thing you thought you could lift requires a different angle. He took those risks with eyes open, and in doing so, wrote a manual for longevity that had less to do with preservation than with permission. If your heroes never change, they stop being heroes and start being statues. Statues are for pigeons. Heroes are for work. Work is the right word. The myth says genius arrives like lightning. The ledger says otherwise. Work as scales at inconvenient hours, lyrics revised when sleep seems kinder, meetings where budgets plead their sad little cases and art insists on being expensive, because truth usually is. Work is saying no when the wrong yes would taste sweet for a day and cost you months. Work is letting someone who loves you erase a line you're sure will save the song, and then admitting they were right. Work is going home after the show and treating the people there like they are not the intermission. He learned these versions of the word the hard way and then, imperfectly, lived them. That is a kind of courage the stage can't measure. The city that raised him answered in brick and bronze. Murals multiplied like wildflowers on derelict walls, eyes lifting over alleyways to catch someone looking back. A plaque appeared outside a community center with music rooms whose windows do not close properly and therefore must be used in all weather. A scholarship fund took his name and then, more importantly, his intention, help the kid who needs a key to the building more than he needs a brand new instrument. Imagine the first time that kid unlocks the door alone, flicks on fluorescent lights that hum like bees, and realizes the room is theirs for an hour. If you want to understand legacy, picture that hour. Picture the first chord. Picture the second. Industry autopsies tried to quantify what made the phenomenon portable. Was it the tritone? The downtuned gravity? The chorus discipline? They're not wrong to ask, but they're answering the manageable questions. The unmanageable one is this. Why did a voice that sounded like nothing natural make millions feel more like themselves? Maybe because honesty sounds strange in a world trained to sand edges. Maybe because he gambled everything on sincerity and survived the embarrassment that sometimes follows. Maybe because survival, repeated in public, becomes a kind of hymn everyone knows the words to whether they admit it or not, some nights. The family pulled down boxes labeled with the year and the city and laughed at the hair and the fabric decisions and the backstage faces that looked older than their ages, then younger than their ages, then exactly right. Memory misbehaves under fluorescent light. That's fine. They weren't looking for accuracy. They were looking for presence. He is present in the way a room rearranges when a certain laugh has been heard in it thousands of times. He is present in the way someone reaches for a remote and, halfway through the reach, decides to leave the silence intact because sometimes silence is the only respectful answer. There is always a last interview to rewatch. It's tempting to treat it like a Rosetta Stone, to hunt for premonition, to circle words that can be made to hold more weight than they were designed for. Don't. Let the man speak like a man. Let him be contradictory and funny and tired and earnest. Let him say, I'm wobbling, and then, in the same breath, plan next summer. Let him deflect with a joke that only half deflects. We are all misquoted by our futures. He will be no different. What can be different is the way we quote him to ourselves, as permission to wobble and keep going. If you are making something, anything, consider this a dare to finish it. Consider it a dare to let it be imperfect in public and improved in time. Consider it a dare to anchor your bravado to kindness so that the people who have to live with you do not become collateral damage for your art. Consider it a dare to love something enough to be ridiculous for it. All the best art looks a little ridiculous 10 minutes before the world catches up. The anniversaries will come with their own liturgies. First year, an arena full of candles on phone screens, a sound engineer who used to be a kid in row 19 tears up during line check and pretends it's the smoke machine. Fifth year, a scholar publishes a book arguing that heaviness is a philosophy before it is a sound and points to a boy from Aston as the philosopher who wrote with a mic instead of a pen. 10th year, a museum exhibit lets kids isolate tracks and discover, to their delighted horror, that drums can feel like weather, guitars like tectonics, a bass like architecture, a voice like nerve. The dates will do their work. But the real work will happen on regular Tuesdays when someone who isn't sure they want to be here presses play and decides to be here for 4 more minutes because a chorus told them to. At 76, a human life ended. That is the simple, devastating arithmetic. But the echo continues in ways that defy tidy close. Echoes do not ask permission. They do not check the room's readiness. They seed themselves in fibers, speaker cones, denim jackets, the cords of microphones that remember the grip of a particular hand, and then they do what echoes do, return, altered by the surfaces they touch. The settings will change. The people will rotate. But somewhere, always, a needle will drop, a file will buffer, a drumstick will click twice against a rim, and a room will remember how to be brave. This is not consolation. It is responsibility carried forward by anyone who ever sang louder than their fear. If you're still here, write to him. 1 line. 3 words. A paragraph if that's what's needed. Thank you, Ozzy, will do fine. So will, I made it. So will, I'm trying. Put it below. Send it to a friend. Whisper it to a ceiling fan that has overheard worse. Then do one small thing in the direction of the life you want: the call, the chord, the apology, the walk around the block that convinces your body you're still in it. Grief is heavy. We have learned some things about heavy. We know how to carry it together. Rest easy, Prince of Darkness. The joke's on the dark. We learn to see in it. And somewhere, right now, a kid in a too big jacket, in a too small room, is learning to turn doubt into decibels. When they finally get the chorus right, the air will change. We will recognize the weather. We will know your work is still working. One day, today for some of you, next week for others, you'll be sitting in traffic or washing dishes or waiting for a download bar to crawl across a screen, and a lyric will ambush you. Not the chorus, the stray line between the big parts, the sentence that never made it onto the t-shirt. It'll land without ceremony and rearrange the furniture in your chest. That's how you know the loss has matured into something you can live with. The art stops asking for a eulogy and starts offering instructions again. In Birmingham, a youth worker unlocked the side door of a rehearsal space and found 3 kids already there, early, arguing about a tempo none of them could hold yet. He didn't correct them. He told them a story instead, about a factory town and a band that made fatigue sound holy, and watched the argument turn into practice. Across an ocean, a night shift nurse took her break in a windowless room and let a headphone thunder remind her that being tired and being finished are different states. In a small apartment above a mechanic shop, a man in his 50s plugged in the cheap guitar he'd bought at 19 and never quite learned, and he let his neighbors complain because, for 10 minutes, he was building a cathedral out of a riff. The complaint letters can wait. The 10 minutes could not. People keep asking what made him different, hoping there's a trick they can borrow, a setting on the amp, a note on the scale that was his secret. There were no doors he slipped through that you can't find. The difference was insistence. He insisted that the mess belonged in the room with the music. He insisted that the apology belonged there, too. He insisted that the love be visible, that the joke be unembarrassed, that the fear be named and then sung over until it lost its job. He insisted, most of all, that heaviness could mean hospitality, that the loudest rooms could be the safest if everyone agreed to hold one another up instead of knock one another down. The scholars will write the big histories. Good. Let them. They'll trace the genealogy of riffs, the chordal innovations, the production choices that made a vocal sit inside a storm instead of riding the top of it. They'll footnote the split with the band, the resurrected solo arc, the collapse and the return, the late career courage to look ridiculous in the pursuit of something real. But the other history, the one you live inside, will not fit between covers. It's written every time a security guard at a venue watches a crowd become a single organism and decides to love their job again. It's written every time a parent hears a door slam and a small amp come alive and chooses not to knock, not yet. It's written when a person who thought they were finished with themselves decides to be patient for one more day because a song promised it was worth it. He did not fix the world. Nobody does. He did not fix himself, not permanently. Nobody does that either. What he did was harder and smaller and, because of that, more useful. He kept coming back to the work. When the voice wobbled, he learned the wobble. When the hand shook, he gripped differently. When the body refused, he found other rituals. He cracked jokes that made grief blink. He apologized without adding the poisonous word, but he took the myth and walked it into the kitchen, into the clinic, into the practice room, until it was domesticated enough to live with and wild enough to matter. There's a studio reel somewhere with a count-in you've never heard, soft, almost shy. The opposite of spectacle. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the impact, the room turning into weather. That's the lesson worth stealing. The count-in. The breath before the work. The quiet discipline that makes the noise honest. Put your own count-in somewhere you can hear it. Whisper it on mornings when the weight insists you're ornamental. You are not. You're an instrument. Tune. Try. Mississippi, try again. That's the whole secret. Most of us keep dressing up because we don't want to admit how unglamorous it is. In the family house, some objects will never move again, and others will travel. A jacket to a museum. A lyric sheet to a vault. A mug with a chip to a granddaughter who will learn to drink with the chip turned away without anyone telling her to. The dogs will learn new routes. The house will learn new hours. Birthdays will feel complicated and then, eventually, kind. On certain evenings, the living room will become a private screening room, And a concert will unspool across a television while people who loved him talk like he's in the kitchen looking for a snack he's already eaten. They will tell the stories that never fit in interviews, the ones you're not entitled to, and they will laugh the laugh the public rarely hears, the one that arrives quietly and leaves the room softer than it found it. This is how you keep a person. Not with monuments, with repetition. If you are an artist and you are listening, here is your permission slip, signed in noise. Be brave enough to be bad on the way to being good. Be brave enough to be good on the way to being great. Be brave enough to be great and still start over. The world will misunderstand you on purpose sometimes. It will dare you to become your worst headline. Decline. Do the show. Go home. Love the people who make you better and let them be right about you more often than your pride wants to allow. Make rooms safer. Make songs truer. Make jokes at the right time and shut up at the right time. Learn the wobble. Keep walking, and if you're not an artist, if your art is the way you stand up for a coworker, or the way you make dinner taste like home, or the way you listen so hard other people remember how to tell the truth, keep doing that. He did not teach us to be loud for its own sake. He taught us to be loud when loudness is the only honest answer to fear. He taught us to be quiet when someone else needs the mic. He taught us to treat the encore like a privilege and the first note like a promise. There will be arguments, of course, because love breeds them. Which record saves you fastest? Which era holds up best? Which ballad earns its sentiment? And which one leans on the arrangement for more than it should? Good. Argue. That's how you keep the work alive. Play each other the deep cuts. Put your phone on the table and make your case like you're in a courtroom with better lighting. Lose graciously. Win kindly. Then put on the track the other person loves and try, just try, to hear it the way they do. If you can borrow someone else's ears for 4 minutes, you will never be alone in the same way again. When the anniversaries arrive, we'll gather here like this strange chapel of screens and shared time, and we'll do the ritual. We'll tell the stories that have grown new edges. We'll remember the jokes that didn't make the documentaries. We'll pass links, and links will become rooms, and rooms will become communities, and, for a little while, the internet will behave like the town square it keeps promising to be. We will light the only candles we carry everywhere, those little hearts and thumbs, and we will know they are insufficient to the task, and we will use them anyway, because morning makes do with whatever it can reach. So tell us your memory. Not the glossy one. The one with the crooked frame. The one where the mic cut out and the crowd sang the bridge a cappella, and you realized that, for all the smoke and the machine and the myth, the point was this: people together on purpose, louder than their fear. Tell us about the roommate who moved out but left a CD behind that you still play when you're sure no one is listening. Tell us about the song that ruined a perfectly good mascara job in a parking lot. Tell us about the first time a guitar felt like a weapon you could carry without hurting anybody. Tap like as your candle. Subscribe if you want to keep walking this road with us, this strange, beautiful lane where grief and gratitude share a microphone. Give, if you can, to the places that turn noise into ladders. Parkinson's research, animal rescues, music rooms with doors that lock from the inside so kids can make something too loud for the whole way. And then, do the smallest brave thing in your day. Call. Forgive. Practice. Rest. Begin. It will not fix the world. It will make your square inch of it quieter, kinder, truer. That is not nothing. That is what we have. Rest now, Ozzy. Rest, John Michael. We will keep the rooms warm. We will keep the riffs honest. We will learn the wobble and keep walking. And somewhere, tonight, under a low ceiling and a too bright bulb, a kid will count in softly 1, 2, 3, 4, and a song will begin that did not exist before. That sound you hear? That's the world remembering how to be brave. That's your echo, still working. In every scene of this story, arenas and kitchens, green rooms and quiet halls, there's someone you don't see who kept the whole machine alive. Techs who soldered cables at 3 a.m. so a show didn't die, monitor engineers who learned to read a silhouette and nudge the mix when the body said it needed help, tour managers with the uncanny gift of making chaos look like choreography. They've been writing their own eulogies in group chats and emails, swapping the kind of details that never make documentaries. One remembers how he'd test a talkback mic with a nonsense phrase and then, without meaning to, say something exactly right, "Don't be afraid of it," before anyone played a note. Another remembers how he'd hold a door for a line of stagehands like a hotel doorman, as if courtesy were part of the writer. You can learn a lot about a person from how they treat the people who carry the flight cases. Back in Aston, an old pub with a low ceiling put a chalkboard out front. Open mic for the loud and the shy. The first night, 3 acts. A week later, 13. The rule was simple: 2 songs, one of yours and one of his. The night got messy in the best way. A folk singer translated "paranoid" into a tremble and left the room blinking. A metal trio played "Mama, I'm Coming Home" like a storm remembering to apologize. A kid with hands that wouldn't stop shaking gripped a microphone and found out shaking is just rhythm that needs a job. The bartender wiped the same clean glass for an hour because sometimes watching is holier than applause. There's a pattern to how myths behave after the person leaves. At first they inflate, ballooning into something you can see from anywhere. Then they collapse into keepsakes, small enough to hide in a pocket for courage. That's happening now. The documentaries pull focus on the landmarks: Sabbath's birth, the firing, the resurrection, the crash, the diagnosis. Meanwhile, the lives he studied are stockpiling smaller truths. A social worker who keeps a portable speaker in the glove box for late-night visits. A tattooist who gives discounts to anyone bringing proof of a donation to a shelter. A high school band director who draws a crude bat on the whiteboard before competitions and says, "Be brave, not careful." These are not footnotes. They're the book. Collectors will chase test pressings and board tapes. Let them. But don't miss what's happening in the places that can't afford obsession. In a community studio where the foam is peeling off the walls, 2 producers argued about whether to quantize a drummer who keeps landing a hair ahead of the grid. They left it. The drum track felt like a person. In a church basement doubling as a rehearsal room, a choir learned to stack their consonants the way he stacked his own voice, soft on the attack, hard on the release, so the syllables hit like a drum fill. Out on a rooftop, a band learned that volume doesn't fix courage. Courage fixes volume. A journalist asked a question that keeps echoing: what does heavy mean now? Maybe it means refusing spectacle when honesty will do. Maybe it means holding the note a little longer than your breath wants, just to prove to your fear that it answers to you. Maybe it means making rooms that feel like they can hold bad news without collapsing, then inviting people to bring their bad news and set it down for the length of a song. He did that without calling it that. He just kept showing up with a voice that sounded like a siren and a hand that, even when it shook, could still point the way toward the chorus. Sharon kept the calendar on the wall, crossing out the days with a thin black line and adding a dot on the ones that needed a brighter memory. It isn't sentiment, it's navigation. On the dot days, she made calls, old friends, new artists, a fund manager who understands that integrity is not an adjective but a math problem. She greenlit small projects that understand how change actually travels, grants to after-school programs that give kids keys and responsibility, a van for a rescue that can't say no to one more crate, a research team whose lab looks like an overqualified garage. The press wrote about the totals. She cared about the receipts that said cables, snare heads, dog food, patient transport. Elsewhere, the arguments stayed delicious. A podcast devoted a whole episode to the timbre of his double-tracked vocals and whether the secret was purely performance or partially the oxide of a certain tape formula. The answer, both, made nobody happy and everybody satisfied. On a message board that still looks like 2004, fans fought lovingly about the exact moment a live version of War Pigs turns from march to sermon. At the back of a record store, 2 strangers took turns insisting that one particular bridge is the single best proof that heaviness can be tender without losing its teeth. They were both right. That's how bridges work. On a Tuesday that will never trend, a small service happened with the quiet choreography of people who've loved each other for a long time. No arena lighting, no telephoto lenses. Just a circle of chairs, a photograph that looks like laughter about to happen, and the simple liturgy of people saying, out loud, what they are grateful for. Gratitude sounds different in a room without microphones. Less polished. More true. Someone read a page from a notebook that shouldn't be in public and isn't, except in the mouths of those who have earned it. Someone else said nothing, and the silence did not feel empty. It felt